Hello, everyone. Welcome to the final installment of Monday Minutes. Today, we'll be talking about some of the most important concepts in your last lecture topic, the autonomic nervous system. One of the most important things to make sure you understand about the autonomic nervous system is where it fits in with the rest of the nervous system. Remember, the central nervous system includes the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system includes everything else. When we look at the peripheral nervous system, we can think of it as having two arms. There's the somatic and the autonomic. Remember, that word somatic means voluntary. So there's a somatic side and an autonomic side to the peripheral nervous system. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, we're talking about the efferent motor pathways that can be further broken down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So, within the peripheral nervous system, there are somatic portions and autonomic portions. And within that autonomic or involuntary side, we have efferent or motor pathways that can be described as sympathetic, and we have efferent motor pathways that can be described as parasympathetic. The autonomic nervous system sends those efferent motor pathways to effector tissues. And when it comes to the ANS, these effector tissues and cells within the tissues include smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Remember, when it comes to the hollow viscera, the soft organs that are within the thoracic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity, smooth muscle is found within the walls of those organs, in that layer that we called the tunica muscularis. That's the smooth muscle that is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. Cardiac muscle is also innervated by the autonomic nervous system, as are various glands, including the sweat glands. These images are found on slide number 13 in the lecture. If we were to isolate a nerve in the autonomic nervous system and then pull a single thread out of that nerve, we would discover that there were two neurons in the pathway from the central nervous system out to the effector tissues. And those two neurons are referred to as the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. Remember, when we talk about the somatic side of the efferent pathways in the peripheral nervous system, the two neurons were called an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. But in the autonomic nervous system, we have a preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. And the names tell us that there's a ganglion right in the middle. And that's what you're looking at here. The autonomic nervous system is divided into two subsystems, sympathetic and parasympathetic. In the lecture, we talked about how the sympathetic division is often referred to as the fight or flight side of the autonomic nervous system. Another way to think of it is to think of the stressed part of the autonomic nervous system. The parasympathetic division is sort of the opposite. This is the side that we think of when we think of a more relaxed state. Sometimes this is called the feed and breed division or the rest and digest division. One of the most important concepts to remember about the autonomic nervous system is this. Both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are active at all times. What determines the effect is how active each branch is. One or the other branch is going to predominate in activity at any one time. So sometimes you'll have a higher level of sympathetic activity, sometimes you'll have a higher level of parasympathetic activity. It depends on the situation. But because both systems are always active to some degree, we always have a certain background level of activity in our autonomic nervous system, and that is what we call autonomic tone. This image is found on slide number 19, and this is the image that really summarizes for us where the autonomic nervous system is within our body. Remember, we're talking about an efferent motor side of your nervous system. So we're talking about pathways that are coming out of the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system. When you look at the left side of the diagram, we're seeing the sympathetic division of the ANS. And when you look at the right side of the drawing, you can see the parasympathetic division. And in the center, we're looking at all the various organs and organ systems that are innervated. Remember, most viscera have both types of innervation, sympathetic and parasympathetic, and one or the other is going to predominate at any one time. If we look on the left side of the diagram first, in the area that's highlighted in green, we can see the origins of the preganglionic neurons. And as you can see, they are in the thoracic and part of the lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So the neuron cell body of the preganglionic neuron is going to be found somewhere in the thoracolumbar area. The axons that come off of those neuron cell bodies are only going to have to travel a short distance before they synapse with the sympathetic ganglia that are located very close to the spinal column. In other words, those short axons are going to synapse with the neuron cell bodies of the postganglionic neuron. And those neuron cell bodies are located in ganglia that are found up and down this chain of ganglia called the sympathetic chain ganglia. After the synapse occurs, axons will extend from the postganglionic neuron cell body, and these axons are going to be long. They're going to travel out to whatever viscera that particular nerve innervates. So, preganglionic neuron cell bodies, preganglionic axons, synapse with the postganglionic neuron cell bodies, and here are the postganglionic axons going out to whatever effector tissue they innervate. On the parasympathetic side, it looks very different. First of all, the preganglionic neuron cell bodies are not located in the thoracolumbar region. Instead, they're split. They're split into the brain stem and the sacral region of the cord. The preganglionic axons are the long ones on the parasympathetic side. They're going to travel a long way, and they're going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron cell bodies that are located near or even within the viscera. Then the postganglionic neuron has an axon that is much shorter. So, short preganglionic axons, long postganglionic axons, long preganglionic axons, short postganglionic axons. Sympathetic, parasympathetic. Preganglionic neurons are in the thoracolumbar region of the cord. Postganglionic neuron cell bodies are in the sympathetic chain ganglia. Preganglionic neuron cell bodies are found in the brainstem and the sacral region. Postganglionic neuron cell bodies are found near or within the viscera. If we go back to looking at the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons in a thread within a nerve, an autonomic nerve, we can also think about what's happening at those synapses. Remember, there's a synapse between preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, and there's a synapse between postganglionic neuron and effector cells. So when we think about the sympathetic division, at the first synapse, the one between the preganglionic and the postganglionic, the neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. And acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors. At the second synapse, between the postganglionic neuron and the target tissue, the neurotransmitter is going to be norepinephrine. And norepinephrine binds to adrenergic receptors. Remember, the axon for the preganglionic neuron is going to be short in the sympathetic division. The axon for the postganglionic neuron is going to be long in the sympathetic division. If we look at the parasympathetic side, the preganglionic neuron has a long axon, and the postganglionic neuron has a short one. The first synapse uses acetylcholine, just like we saw in the sympathetic division. Acetylcholine, cholinergic receptors. The postganglionic synapse with the target tissue is also going to use acetylcholine here. Also binding to cholinergic receptors. This is where those terms nicotinic and muscarinic come in. In other words, the receptors here are cholinergic nicotinic, and the receptors here are cholinergic muscarinic. But in both cases, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter. This is just a summary diagram of that exact same thing that we've just talked about. Remember, in the peripheral nervous system, we're going to find some afferent sensory nerves and some efferent motor nerves. And all of those nerves are associated with ganglia, which are just groups of neuron cell bodies. Some of the efferent nerves are going to be somatic, and some of the efferent nerves are going to be autonomic. Within those autonomic nerves, some of them are going to be sympathetic, and some of them are going to be parasympathetic. The arrow at the upper top represents a somatic motor nerve. Remember, that's going to travel down, and it's going to synapse with skeletal muscle. The neurotransmitter that gets released here is acetylcholine. We've talked about this. The autonomic nervous system, remember, has two different divisions in it. So efferent motor autonomic nerves can be either sympathetic or parasympathetic. Both types have a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron inside of them. Preganglionic, postganglionic. And both types synapse on either smooth muscle or cardiac muscle or glands. The preganglionic neuron is going to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. And at that synapse, acetylcholine is released. And it's going to bind to nicotinic receptors. The postganglionic neuron is going to synapse with the effector tissue. And it's going to release norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter, which binds to adrenergic receptors. If we look at the parasympathetic side, at the first synapse, it looks very similar to the sympathetic side. The neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, and it's going to bind to nicotinic receptors. So it doesn't matter if we're looking at the sympathetic branch or the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. At the first synapse between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter, and it's going to bind to a nicotinic receptor on both sides. It's the second synapse that's different. At the second synapse, the postganglionic neuron synapses with the effector. And if you look at the parasympathetic division, the neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine, and it's going to bind to muscarinic receptors. So this is where the big difference is, right at the effector tissue. Now I want to make one other point here about the sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system. Sometimes students will ask me, where does epinephrine come in? We see that norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter at the second synapse, but where's epinephrine? At some synapses in the sympathetic division, epinephrine will be released, but primarily it's norepinephrine. That is the neurotransmitter that's used. The thing about epinephrine and norepinephrine is this. First of all, epinephrine is derived from norepinephrine. So if you metabolize norepinephrine, you get epinephrine. So they're very closely related to each other chemically. The second thing to know is that both of these chemicals, epinephrine and norepinephrine, not only serve as neurotransmitters, but they're also hormones. Remember what a hormone is. It's a chemical that is produced in one part of the body, but has its effect in another part of the body. And when it comes to epinephrine and norepinephrine, they come from the adrenal gland. So they can be released from the adrenal gland, and they can be used in other parts of the body in order to produce sympathetic effects. So they're unusual molecules in that they serve two functions as both neurotransmitters and as hormones. When it comes to the neurotransmitter function, norepinephrine is king. Remember, most of our viscera have dual innervation in terms of the autonomic nervous system. Most of our viscera are innervated with both sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers. So that means one or the other is going to predominate at any one time, and that's what produces the different effects that we see. There are some examples, though, where only sympathetic fibers are present or only parasympathetic fibers are present. And what's important to remember is that even if there's only one kind of innervation, only sympathetic, for example, you can still get different effects. effects. The example that we used in lecture was blood vessels. Sympathetic fibers that innervate blood vessels can have two different effects on those blood vessels. Sympathetic fibers help keep blood vessels in a state of sort of partial constriction. That's what we refer to again as tone. And by increasing the rate of the action potential firing, we can see different effects. The faster or the more rapidly the action potentials are firing will cause the smooth muscles in our arteries to contract, and that will constrict those arteries. But if we slow down the firing through those sympathetic fibers, if fewer action potentials arrive across time, the smooth muscle will relax and the blood vessels will dilate. So you can see opposing effects even when there's only one kind of innervation. The last thing we covered in the lecture, and the last thing I'll point out today, is the control center of the autonomic nervous system. Remember, here it's all about the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the major control center of those autonomic efferent motor pathways. Within the hypothalamus, there are several deep nuclei of gray matter. Remember, the hypothalamus performs a lot of different functions. It helps control our basal body temperature, and it controls our thirst and our hunger. It has impact on our very primal emotional state, even our sexual desires. We know that the cerebrum and the limbic system can feed into the hypothalamus and help control the output that the hypothalamus is going to make along those efferent motor pathways of the autonomic nervous system. But it's the hypothalamus that is the primary control center. That's it for our review of the autonomic nervous system. As you're studying, be sure that you can list 3 or 4 examples of the effects that the sympathetic division has on an effector versus the parasympathetic. Be sure that you can tell me, for example, that the sympathetic division is going to cause our pupils to dilate, while the parasympathetic division will cause them to constrict. The sympathetic division is going to make our mouths go dry, while the parasympathetic is going to cause an increase in salivation. Make sure you can list, 3 or 4 examples of the effects of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic on a particular effector tissue. So good luck on your final common assessment this week, and good luck as you prepare for your final exam next week. And as always, message me through Canvas if you have any questions.